My name is Matt Kahn. I'm the director of the Center for Southern California Studies, which operates out of California State University in Northridge. And this panel, which is entitled A Window of Opportunity, Multidisciplinary Views of California Citizenship in the 21st Century, brings together several CSU faculty who have participated in a summer-long colloquium on this question. And I have to, I don't know if Tim is here, he popped out. I have to thank Tim for subsidizing the colloquium and generously offering to help support the research of my colleagues and myself. The issue, as you know, when we think about California citizenship, goes well beyond the notion of traditional or legal citizenship. What we're really talking about, and what I think the nature of the papers you will hear about today are thinking about, is what it means to be a Californian as we anticipate the millennium change, as we anticipate the next century. What I'm going to do is simply introduce my colleagues briefly. Because we have 5 people presenting, I'm going to do my best to limit them to about 10 minutes. Following their comments, we're going to go right into some discussion with you, which is, of course, the most interesting and important part of the panel environment. So starting on my far left is Amir Hussain, who was Assistant Professor of Religious Studies at California State University in Northridge. Phil Goff is Associate Professor, thank you, Associate Professor of History and Religious Studies at Cal State Los Angeles. Fred Chrisman is a lecturer in anthropology at Cal State Northridge. Nathan Weinberg is Professor of Sociology at Northridge, Cal State Northridge, and Jaime Regalado is Executive Director of the Pat Brown Institute at Cal State LA. And I think we'll just start, did we agree that we'll just go in order of the way we're sitting? So we'll start with Amir.
Good afternoon. This is my first trip to Sacramento. As you might be able to tell from the accent, I'm a Canadian, and so there may be some words that I pronounce differently. I make sure to put the U in the spellings with them. It's my first trip to Sacramento, and I spent this morning at the legislature, looking around outside at the building, the state capitol, really moved by the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. Looking at that, and it reminded me of what it is that I'm going to be talking to you about, which my own research as part of this colloquium that Matt described has to do with the Muslim communities in Southern California, how they are envisioning, imagining, participating in the political, cultural life of California as Muslims, as citizens of California, looking at it from that perspective. And I realized sitting there looking at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, that that's not something new, that this idea of Muslims being involved in American political life. And I was thinking back to 1968, Muhammad Ali, my moral touchstone on a lot of issues, refusing induction for the Vietnam War on the grounds that as a Muslim, he wouldn't fight the war. And what happened there, I'm not a historian, I'm not a political scientist, so I don't know all the details, from the legal point of view of that event, but a very significant event in this nation's history from a Muslim perspective. So I thought that was a nice way of beginning, simply talking about the fact that that involvement, that participation isn't new. It's been here. The Muslim community here isn't new. It's been here for a long period of time. Now, in numbers, it hasn't been here for a long period of time. The first mosque that was built in America was built in Ross, North Dakota, about 1936, 1937. The first communities that came here, immigrant communities, didn't really have a sense of staying here. The idea was the gold rush that Warren only talked about. It was coming to America, making money, going back. And so there wasn't that sense of establishing structures, communities, institutions, things like that, until later on, when people came with no sense of going back, where this was the place that they were going to be. And so you saw in the 1950s the beginning of Muslim organizations, culminating 1981 with the large umbrella group, the Islamic Society of North America, that in 1986 came up with a report to the Muslim community saying that they should be, as Muslims, actively involved in the American political process. So that event is relatively new for the Muslim community. It's been only since 1986 that Muslims have had that really active role in terms of, doing things as Muslims as part of the communities here. That's the sort of stuff that I'm looking at. There's lots of different issues that one can talk about, and I'll be happy to talk about them more during our discussion if people want to explore those issues. But the idea of, how is it that the Muslim community works, lives, expresses its Muslimness, but also its Americanness? Because you've seen that shift since the 1920s, 1930s, from an immigrant community that was going to go back to an immigrant community that's here, where there is no going back. The idea that, we are Americans and we are Muslims, and how do we incorporate ourselves as Muslims into American political, civil, social life, those sorts of questions. It's a brand new field. We don't even have exact numbers. I've seen estimates for the Muslim community in in America, as low as 3 million. I've seen estimates as high as 9 million. The best estimate that I've seen and looked at is probably about 6 million, which when you think about it is relatively small compared to the overall population of America, 6 million Muslims in America. Except if you start looking at the breakdown of religious traditions. Christianity is overwhelmingly the largest religious tradition in America. Then comes Judaism. Then comes Islam. And it's a close second now. In the next century, it'll be the second largest tradition. What does that mean? That in the next century, there will be more Muslims in America than there are Jews in America. How does one deal with that reality? What will that reality look like? In Southern California, the estimate is something like 500,000 Muslims. I'm involved in a subcommittee of the Census Committee that's looking at Muslim representation. How do we actually count this? And I'm really glad that the Census Committee is doing this, not just for the Muslim community, but other communities as well. How do we accurately count the number of people in America? But they're making concerted effort this time to target communities that traditionally have been neglected or not represented within the census. And so after the results of the Census 2000, we'll have much better figures as to exact numbers. But that's one example of things that are happening. Muslims being involved in the American political scene. In Southern California, where I now live, the Muslim Public Affairs Council is quite active. Their chairman, and you may have been familiar with this in the news in the last little while, was for a very short period of time selected to do a commission on terrorism in D.C. He was then, I don't know what the nice word is, but asked not to be on that board because of certain views that he had, where he dared to say that perhaps in some instances the State of Israel did not act according to the rule of law, which is something that the State of Israel itself has acknowledged in lots of documents. But it was this sort of thing happening, that he couldn't be a member of this panel on terrorism. And the powers that be in Washington bowed down to that, took him off the panel. Those sorts of things galvanize the Muslim community and say, wait a minute, what's going on here? What's happening? And I think what you'll see, and let me end my remarks here, is much greater participation, much greater involvement in the political system, because you do have now that second or third generation of people for whom, as I said before, the identity is both American and Muslim, and how one expresses that within an American context, how one expresses one's Islam in that context. I think those expressions will be really interesting ones to look at.
Thank you, Amir.
Well, it's nice from up here anyway to have both the people who work in religion on the left, usually see them on the right on most issues. Los Angeles receives a bad rap in a number of ways. The one that, of course, I'm interested in is the assumption that the City of Angels is a godless city. And that's how it's usually talked about in film and literature. But recent studies indicate that simply is not so. Its religious life is very vibrant, it's very diverse, and it's also meeting the needs of its various and changing communities. It was once the widest, by the way, the widest and the most Protestant large city in the country in the early part of the century. Today, its ethnic diversity is matched only by its religious diversity. It is, in fact, the most ethnically and religiously diverse city in the world, with over 600 different identified faith groups residing in Los Angeles. In order to understand what I'm working on, my project generally, just, if there's a title to it, it's faith-based community service in 21st century Los Angeles. In order to understand, I think, the way faith-based community service will work its way out in the next century, we have to understand the role of religion in modern Los Angeles. Sociologists at the University of Southern California have put together a fascinating profile of religion in Los Angeles neighborhoods. I want to just, they went in depth for several years and studied 4 particular neighborhoods, and I just want to give you a couple of facts they came up with. In Jefferson Park, an area which is just larger than 3 square miles, you'll find 86 separate religious congregations. In other words, about 28 religious meeting places per square mile. In Boyle Heights, in an area of about 3¼ square miles, there are 55 congregations, which is 17 per square mile. Listen to the diversity here. There are 5 Buddhist, 8 Catholic, 8 Evangelical Protestant, 2 Mainline Protestant, 1 Jewish, 5 Japanese, 4 Seventh-day Adventist, and 21 Pentecostal religious meeting places, all in 3¼ square miles. In the Mid-Wilshire District, under 2½ square miles, you'll have 81,000 residents, 125 congregations, about 50 per square mile. And finally, in Pico Union, just under 2 square miles, 110 congregations, about 59 per square mile. Now, just as impressive and more important for our interest, I think, are the hundreds of neighborhood faith-based nonprofit organizations that have been created right alongside these churches to meet the physical needs of the community. This is where you really see faith at work in the community and solving solving problems on the small scale, at the micro level. These are very small, nearly off the radar screen nonprofit organizations that have been started by the churches or the temples or the synagogues themselves, but as a separate entity, a separate legal entity. Therefore, they can take money from the state and federal government to run these organizations. You'll find the number of small churches, by the way. The church board will meet. At the end of the church board meeting, the pastor will then say, all right, we're finished with that. Now I call to meeting the order of such and such organization. And they hold their meeting and talk about literacy programs, entrepreneurial programs, counseling teenagers. Those different neighborhoods I gave you, Jefferson Park had 86 congregations. Well, it has 43 religiously affiliated nonprofit corporations. In other words, about 1 for every 2 churches and temples. Also 10 religiously affiliated state licensed schools. In each of the different neighborhoods, in fact, you could count on 1 religious nonprofit organization for every 2 to 3 religious meeting sites. That's happening on the small scale. On the large scale, you have, especially since about in the past 10 years, a number of groups that have grown up in Los Angeles, religious-based groups. The Esperanza Community Housing Corporation started in 1989, for instance. It's a grassroots organization using partnerships with churches, schools, health agencies, and block clubs to pursue economic development and to help formulate progressive public policy. The list is endless. I wrote down a number of them here. A very interesting one, I think, is the Interfaith Coalition for Immigrant Rights, started in 1994. Over 1,000 congregations in Los Angeles, from the Buddhist, Christian, Jewish, and Muslim traditions together, sponsoring public events and publishing faith-based commentaries on immigrants and refugee rights. It basically serves as a clearinghouse for all other religious meeting places who are interested in these issues. The Muslim Public Affairs Council in 1989 hopes to create an American Muslim constituency to act as an influential component in U.S. Public affairs. There are over 1,300 of these large and small-scale organizations in Los Angeles. It's also interesting, by the way, that in this explosion of organizations, a number of old alliances have been renewed. There's a strong labor movement within the Catholic Church. Los Angeles Times recently, in fact, had a large article, a very good one, on the growing labor movement in Los Angeles and how it's based in the Latino community. It's not surprising then that the Catholics are involved. 7 of every 10 Christians in Los Angeles is Catholic, and 7 of every 10 of those is Latino-Latina. And so about half of all Christians in Los Angeles are Latino Catholics, very involved in the labor movement, and the Catholic Church is being very responsive to that aspect of their congregation. What's at issue here, finally, I think, and looking at how things are going to work out in the next century, is the question of the constitutionality of these faith-based groups. As you can imagine, there's a good bit of discussion about this, especially the small ones, which tend to be more based in particular Orthodox traditions. A recent study of 10 of these institutions identified 3 as putting forward what is called a generally secular ethos. You couldn't really tell you were in a religious institution when you went there for counseling or for services. One of them had what was called a culturally religious ethos, and I can actually show you later if you want to look at the study, the breakdown of how they define these. 4 of the 10 put forward a moderately sectarian ethos, and 2 a pervasively sectarian ethos. Now currently the Supreme Court is letting these things slip by. 1989 decision, Bowen versus Kendrick. By the way, it's been since 1989 when we've seen this explosion of these small organizations. Bowen versus Kendrick decision regarding the Adolescent Family Life Act stated that authorized grants are allowable to religious institutions and organizations to provide counseling for teenage sexuality. Justice Rehnquist wrote the decision and basically said that this practice is consistent with the country's, as he put it, quote, long history of cooperation and interdependency between governments and charitable or religious institutions. In other words, basically, so long as the funds do not go into pervasively sectarian actions, there is no harm done. And the proof, by the way, according to the Supreme Court, the proof that these are pervasively sectarian is on the litigant. So they have to go case by case. The Supreme Court said they will not throw these out just because some might be pervasively sectarian. Blackmun, of course, dissented, and he's got a very interesting dissent. The point is, though, the funds going into these church-related organizations do at times cross that line. But since these are usually small organizations helping local neighborhoods, it's unlikely that any litigant is going to try to shut them down. Is it over the line of separation of church and state? Yes, in some and perhaps many cases. Will it stop? No, I don't think so, given the court's present attitude and the fact that both the presidential frontrunners support giving block grants to states so that they can give them to institutions such as this. So I think we can expect to see more of it. The deeper question I suppose I'm going to leave you with, and one that I'm struggling with myself, how can we want it to stop? I am someone who has great respect for the separation of church and state, and I fear any sort of crossing of the line because of a slippery slope. On the other hand, my respect for the separation of church and state is probably matched only by my hatred for poverty and illiteracy and unwanted teenage pregnancy. So, as far as issues of citizenship, I think we need to look at the role of religion in helping immigrants become citizens through these organizations, helping to politically activate these legal immigrants, and also the role of religion in helping disadvantaged citizens gain more control over their lives.
Thank you. Fred.
Oh, you're gonna be cleanup? Okay.
Yes, I will try and tie these together at the end. And
cool.
As Fred said, I will be cleanup.
Great.
Thank you for.
I thought you were next. Okay.
I didn't. Do you want a moment? I could.
Nope.
Okay.
I'm in
Gather
there.
yourself.
Afternoon, everybody. The title of my paper that I'm just about finished doing, Matt might be pleased to know, is undocumented Mexicans in California disenfranchising some of our best and brightest 21st century citizens, students as well. And the problem is pretty basic. We've just gone through approximately a decade of the worst of nativist sentiments that the state of California has seen since at least the late 1920s, when at least 500,000 Mexicans and Mexican Americans were summarily repatriated, to use the polite word, to Mexico at the beginning of the Depression, and the various types of ill treatment that we have meted out at different times in the past to Asian Americans. And the result is that a population, 700,000 Mexican farm workers that work in the state's #1 industry, have always been very marginalized due to the history of their treatment in California, but that in the latest wave they have become just this close to complete, utter disenfranchisement. Many of these people, and of course the 700,000 farm workers, represent the working adults of families, so we're talking about 1 million or more people that are involved in this process, are increasingly afraid of all sorts of officials, whether it be teachers or hospital representatives, the police, other officials, even innocuous anthropologists such as myself. And it makes it quite questionable how well, which it never has gone very well, but how well the 2000 census will be carried out when we supposedly seek to find out the true extent of various populations in California. But beyond the fact that they're increasingly fearful is the fact that most of them will probably eventually become legal residents. Many of them will eventually become citizens, and their US-born children are citizens by birthright. And so we're integrating our 21st century citizens in the worst possible way, using the stick entirely and not even thinking about using a carrot in terms of trying to incorporate this huge population into the civic society that we have, that we claim that we have here in California. And the latest statistics, which really show the magnitude of the problem of disenfranchising these folks, is that a recent Urban Institute study estimates that close to 50% of the children in Los Angeles County have at least one undocumented parent. So we're talking about, in certain parts of the state, huge concentrations. But it's not restricted to urban areas. There are over 100 incorporated towns in rural California that my mentor, Juan Vicente Palermo, calls farm worker enclaves, where the vast majority of the population is Mexican origin, and where the vast majority of the adults have their jobs in agriculture, and yet where most of those cities have entirely or all but entirely white representatives at every level of local government in terms of mayor, city council, school board, water board, police chief, etc. And so you have a situation in some towns, about 100, where 10 to 15% of the population runs everything for a predominantly legal immigrant and or undocumented immigrant population, and there's no connection between the two. Small wonder that Michael Burraway, a long time ago, the distinguished sociologist at Berkeley, compared the agricultural system in California with then still existent apartheid system in South Africa. And he referred to the situation at that time in rural California as being an American apartheid. So the question is there a better way to try to help to integrate this large and rapidly growing population into civil society? And before I show how profound the problems are in terms of the case studies that I want to use, Oops, I blanked. Oh well. Things happen spontaneously sometimes, and sometimes they disappear spontaneously. Okay. I want to point out, among other things, that regardless of what U.S. immigration policy may or may not be, there are public and popular policies and practices that could be implemented in the state of California to make things much better than they currently are. And I did, 7 years of doctoral dissertation and postdoctoral work in the communities of McFarland and Farmersville in Tulare and Kern County. Oh, it comes back to me. This is kind of important. These towns, where more than 50% of the adults work in agriculture, I've been able to document in my research, the main focus of my research before Matt gave me the small grant to use a crystal ball about citizenship, has been to document how the agribusiness sector, which generates close to $30 billion a year, using 700,000 farm workers, actively, through its personnel practices, recruits new undocumented workers in Mexico. And the reason why I finally remembered that point again is that I did half of my research in McFarland and Farmersville, and then the other half in rural Mexico, where I saw these labor recruitment activities ongoing. So our U.S. immigration policy essentially is to beat up upon and in recent years kill large numbers of Mexicans trying to cross the border, despite the fact that even though we call them criminal illegal aliens, the only criminals are the agribusiness owners that purposely recruit these desperately poor people in Mexico to come here in large numbers every year to keep wages low and working conditions substandard. So what's the situation in McFarland and Farmersville? Basically, you have between 75 and 90% of the U.S. census population being Mexican origin. And since the census is done at the beginning of spring, and since the harvest peak season is in the late summer and early fall, when these communities grow by about 50% to accommodate the demand for farm labor in that period, it's really the tip of the iceberg. And yet, Farmersville, to at least as of 1994, which is when I finished this work in California, had yet to elect a single Latino to any local representative office. In McFarland, there was usually one on one of the various boards that I mentioned earlier. And so you don't have good political representation. One of the ways that this is sustained, along with the fact that most of these people are relatively recent immigrants, many of them aren't even here legally, is that they maintain at-large voting districts, which have been found to be undemocratic in places like Watsonville and various parts of Texas, and yet still persist because you have to have individual lawsuits to try to change these in each of these individual communities. So when a community crisis occurs, what you have is you have a tiny, unrepresentative white elite that is allied almost entirely in every case with the major economic power in the region, which is agribusiness, on one side, and then you have the large majority of the residents who are Mexican farm workers feeling completely disenfranchised, unrepresented. And as many of you have probably heard, because it keeps coming up, McFarland is the site of perhaps the best-known case of environmental racism in California, the cancer cluster. And if you look at the history of the cancer cluster all through the 80s and into the early 90s, while the people in the community organized and responded to, for example, surveys that were administered by the California Department of Health at rates of more than 96%, which is astounding when you consider the fact that a lot of these people are afraid to interact with officials, are not bilingual or English speaking, and all of those good things. They, on the one hand, are agitating for answers to why so many of their children, at rates that are 4.5 times greater than should be statistically normal in a community of that size, have cancer. On the other hand, you have the elite constantly saying it's a statistical fluke and that it's ruining property values and undermining confidence in the agribusiness economy, etc. So you have a complete disconnect. In Farmersville, you have a case where the Farmersville police decided it was a good idea at the end of the harvest season to get rid of some of that surplus 50% of the population that comes during the harvest season by inviting in the Immigration and Naturalization Service to conduct a raid, in which homes were broken into, doors broken down, a lot of people beaten. And the response to that, which was shortly after the rebellion in Los Angeles in the same year, was what the media styled a rural ethnic riot in which at least 500 members of the community shut down the major intersection in Farmersville and demanded that the local police stop inviting in the INS to clear the streets. In neither case, as of 1994, anything really changed, and that's the problem, and that's why we have to come up with some solutions. I do want to point out that I have given you examples of resistance by the majority, as disempowered as they are within the society, to these crises. They have tried to fight back and have been relatively effective, if you can call having the media come in being effective. Is that my 10-minute 1 minute or my 12-minute 1 minute?
12-minute.
Okay. Oh, geez, then we're going to have to wrap it up, aren't we? One of the solutions is to reinstitute a long abandoned but old pattern of allowing non-citizens to vote in non-federal elections. Up until the early 1900s, 22 states in the United States allowed non-citizens to vote in non-federal elections. It was only as a result of the reactions against immigration at that period that they took away that right. New York and Chicago currently allow non-citizens to vote in school board elections. So this is one way that we can start to integrate these people into their local communities. The other way is to make these communities more culturally sensitive to the people that are the vast majority there by allowing people to participate in the rituals that they love to participate in Mexico but fear to participate in California, things like posadas, things like having a plaza where they can go and visit in the evenings instead of being locked up in their homes. And that, of course, is starting to be done when it's economically recognized in urban areas like Panorama City, where they're currently building a plaza complex to try to get money out of the impoverished Pacoima area and Panorama City area residents by actually being more inviting. And then there's one other point I want to make, and that is that the old models, and a lot of people go, what? Let non-citizens vote? That's not American. And of course, I've already pointed out that it was until we got scared of immigrants, white immigrants, as it turns out, at the turn of the century. The assimilation and pluralistic models for citizenship do not reflect the reality of the past. Every immigrant group has come to the United States and fought for their rights on all levels and made the United States a better place. There's a new model called the cultural citizenship model, which was pioneered by Renato Rosaldo, which points out the reality of how each group has to fight for the specific needs of its community at the time that it is enduring the nativist sentiments of the dominant majority, or at least the economic powers within a society. And it's those fights that make the United States what it is. What would the United States be, for example, if African Americans didn't create a civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s? And what we're going to be seeing, whether we like it or not, is Latinos and Asians and other immigrants demanding more rights and more respect in the communities that they live in, where they work, where they pay taxes, and where they're raising their children. And so I'm hoping we could be proactive and encourage that rather than resisting it. Thanks.
Thank you, Fred. Nathan?
Okay. Well, I think Fred has kind of given you a very dramatic presentation of disenfranchisement in the rural areas of California. My focus is more on the urban areas of the small towns and cities of California. And I'm specifically focused on the kinds of citizen activities and democratic practices that go on in our cities. I just wanted to read you a little quote here from the Los Angeles Times. This was about a meeting held in July in Los Angeles. The first public hearing on one of the most consequential issues facing Los Angeles, the San Fernando Valley's potential secession from the city, went off without a hitch Wednesday, with only one trifling exception. Not a single person from the public showed up. Present were a handful of city officials, a private consultant, a couple of reporters, and several leaders of the breakaway movement. The usual faces, in other words. Now, that's really the problem I wish to address here. There's been a lot of discussion here at the conference on voting rights and enfranchisement and bringing different groups into our society. But I wish to address a kind of what I would think of as a more general issue, which is the model of democratic practice. I think each of you has an idea of what you think of as democratic practice, small d democratic practice. And I think in our society we cultivate what you might call democratic manners. I think we treat each other in a fashion which is democratic. We try to listen to each other. And in a sense, we hope that our political process will follow that. We expect people to come to meetings, to exchange views, to deliberate with each other, to reach some sort of policy conclusion, perhaps to vote. I think that's the model that many of us work with. I think it's the model that we learn in our schools. At least I hope we learn it in our schools. It would be interesting to know whether it still is being taught in the schools. I think if we lose this kind of democratic practice and democratic manner, then we will become a less democratic society. Some groups may gain power, other groups may lose power, but I mean, I think we need to ask ourselves, do we want to become a less democratic society? Is that what we desire for California in the next century? There's every potential that we are heading in that direction. So it's not clear to me that we will sustain democratic practices. In Los Angeles, certainly, as I think Warren Only did a great job in talking about LA earlier, and it's hard to follow him because he really just fabulous talk. Anyway, in Los Angeles, one could argue that there's very little in the way of democratic practice that goes on from the point of view of the average citizen. And what I'd like to do is to contrast the small towns with Los Angeles. If you go to a small town, let's say a town of between 25,000 or up to maybe 100,000 people, not in the rural areas, I think you can find that people can go to city council meetings. They can get involved in the process of their local government. Now, that doesn't mean that they do. A lot of people are apathetic and do not get involved. But if you, as a citizen in one of these small towns, wants to get involved, you can come forward and go to the meetings and you can work your way into the system. I don't think that's true in Los Angeles. Los Angeles is obviously much more complex. It's much larger, 3 million plus people if you're just working within the city limits. Each city council person represents about 200,000 people, between 200 and 300,000 people. So it's very difficult for the average citizen to come in and get access within that system. In doing the research for this paper, I was trying to gather information about what was going on in different small towns and in Los Angeles. And in most of the small towns, it's pretty easy to get the information. In Los Angeles, it's very difficult to get the information. That's one of the problems I think that needs to be addressed. It is basically how do we get information about government out to people as broadly as we can. Now, one of the interesting developments in the last few years has been the presentation of city council meetings on local cable channels. And so if you're living in a small town like Thousand Oaks, you can watch city council on television. And conceivably, if you saw something interesting, you could drive down to the city hall, which is only a couple of miles away. They have free parking. You could go into the meeting. You could participate. In Los Angeles, that's not quite true. Now, Los Angeles also broadcasts their city council meetings, and if you want to have an instructive experience, I suggest you first try to find out when it's being broadcast. It took me 2 days to find out. I made several calls. I called my city council representative, and they didn't know when it was being broadcast. And they referred me to the agency within the city government that was doing it, and so I did find out that, yes, Channel 35 on my cable channel broadcasts the LA City Council on Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Fridays after 10 o'clock. And so then I proceeded to watch many city council meetings. It wasn't terribly enlightening. But I mean, if you're dedicated, you could work your way into it. You could spend the time, you could think about the issues, you could watch the people in action. And the trouble is, well, let's say I wanted to go down to the meeting. The meeting is taking place 25 miles away from my home. And I don't know if I can get parking down there. All right, and I would have to drive through very heavy traffic to get there. So there's a lot of disincentives to my attempting to participate. And I think most citizens in LA don't go to city council meetings. If they did go, they wouldn't know what to do when they got there. That seems to me to be a very fundamental problem within a democracy. If you have governing bodies in which there's absolutely no way in. So there's more in the paper about that, but what I'd like to sort of talk a little bit about today is what could we do in the next century to maybe change some of the dynamics in a big city like Los Angeles. In a small town, you can still work within the small town model where you can go down to the government, you can see it in action, you run into the political leaders. It seems like in our big cities, what we need to try to do perhaps is to create some sort of a virtual political community, and then link that virtual political community to the actual political community. The virtual community obviously is something that will have to be created on the internet. It's being done, I think. The California Voters Foundation, I think, is making a step in this direction. And Kim Alexander gave us a talk here yesterday, and it was a good talk. And that's the direction I think our city governments need to go. It's not just this foundation that needs to go in this way. Now, most of the city governments already have websites. They need to make that information easier for the citizens to understand. Los Angeles City has a website. You can go there and you can get the city council agendas. You will still be confused. Part of the problem is in continuity, if you will. The information is there, and yet how do you place the information within a meaningful or a comprehensive context in terms of what is going on in the city? If you're in the know, if you're there all the time, then you can do that, but most citizens can't do that. So the information that they read in the newspaper or that they get on the website doesn't fall into any meaningful nexus of connected things. That's a difficult thing to overcome. Santa Monica, a smaller city, also puts on their website their city council minutes, but they summarize them. It seems to me there's absolutely no reason why cities cannot make an attempt to explain to the citizens what they are doing and put it there on the website so that you can read it, and so that if you want to find out what's going on in Los Angeles from day to day or week to week or month to month, you can read back through these summaries of actions that have been taken, and you would be able to establish continuity. At this point, I don't think that is there. It's something that we could do. I think it's something we should do if we hope to continue a democratic model in the society. Now, we could also use these cable channels much more effectively. I think C-SPAN is the model here. We have seen that C-SPAN has made the federal government, I think, much more intelligible to us. That their programming is excellent, that they give us a way into what is going on in Washington. Why shouldn't we do the same thing here on the state level and also on the local levels? There's a lot of work involved in making something like the California channel, which is filming us here, into something more like C-SPAN. But I think that if you take the C-SPAN model, you have a good idea of how you go about creating a virtual community in which there is more information that people can easily get. Okay, once we have the information about what is going on, then also hopefully when meetings are going to happen, when political leaders are going to come into our communities, they'll let us know. Right now, in LA, if a political leader is coming into your community, the chances are you won't find out about it. Unless you happen to read the LA Times and happen to turn to page 10 in the Valley section, the little snippet that happens to have been inserted to tell you. And likely you miss it. So you miss the meetings. Why don't city council people keep email lists and notify people who want to be told when meetings will occur? This is not that difficult. I went to a city council person. I said, I'd like to be on your mailing list. And they said, well, the city attorney told us we can't maintain a mailing list because that would be used for political purposes. Well, maybe they could maintain an email list. Okay. There seems to be a contradiction there. If I'm a citizen, I want to know when the meetings are. I want them to tell me. I want to know about all the meetings. And I want it to come to my computer. So hopefully we can go in that direction. Now, the actual part of this, I've been describing a virtual community. What about the actual community? Well, ultimately you have to sit down with people face to face. Okay, and I only have 1 minute. So let me just say, I think the meetings need to be held where people can come to them. In Los Angeles, the meetings are held so far away from where most people are that they don't come. Now, businesses have realized this doesn't work. Businesses have decentralized and moved their operations to where their clientele are. The centralized bureaucratic structure is breaking down throughout our society. Organizations are decentralizing to be closer to their clientele. If we are citizens, we are the clientele of our government. We want our government to be close to us, and we want to be able to go to the meetings and meet with our representatives, and we want them to talk to us, which they don't currently do very much. So, it would be nice also if they came to our events. If there was a farmers market out here, why weren't there some of the local representatives out here schmoozing with the citizens? The mayor of West Los Angeles held a public meeting at a Vons or Ralph's supermarket, and he was there for his citizens, and I think that's what we should expect of our political leaders. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I mean?
Well, I don't know if Tim's here or not. I think Pat Brown would be delighted with the theme of this conference. I think it's the 11th annual Envisioning California Conference, focusing much on the future. And of course, Pat Brown was very much a futurist, but also a student and a creature of practical politics. I think the only impractical thing that I remember about Pat Brown was that he expected to win his third try at the gubernatorial nod, running against neophyte Ronald Reagan. And he thought that Reagan had no chance at all, but of course, a lot of us were wrong on that, and we're still apologizing for some of that. Yeah. I think the only thing that he wouldn't, find tasteful about this particular session is that somebody bearing the name of the Pat Brown Institute is on the far end of the right, facing you, and I don't think Pat Brown ever would have liked to have been associated with, symbolically or otherwise, with the far right. Democratic practice, Los Angeles. You can hear a lot about Los Angeles today, and of course a little bit later on as well. You've heard a lot about it already. Nathan and I were kind of joking at lunch that virtually everything Warren Only was saying were things that we wanted to say, so we could just take 1 minute each and just sum up. But it's not quite that easy, and we wouldn't get fully paid by Matt if we only took one minute here. And appreciations to Matt, for pulling us all together from different campuses. One person who's not here is from Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, Fred Lau, and we miss him here too as well. But then again, I mean, we're talking heads already, right? So that would have been a sixth person up here talking with you. Reform cities. There's a book by Amy Bridges, a very good friend of mine, a colleague at the University of California, San Diego, who wrote a book recently that I was on a panel sitting in judgment of, the Western Political Science Association Conference, or annual meeting in March in Seattle, that gave a perspective. I mean, the title of it is something like a municipal reform in the Southwest, and we've heard a lot about municipal reform movements, the capital P progressive movements, and what happened to cities under their sway that maybe were formerly machine cities in the past. But basically, the literature in the Southwest, including California, was very, very silent until Amy's book came out. And what she would have to say to Nathan is, how could you expect anything else? Because reform cities tried to take the democracy out of politics as best they could and streamline it so that economic powers that be, and maybe a few other citizens of their judgment, would be those who were thoroughly democratically empowered, but made it difficult for everybody else. And particularly what Fred is coming around to is more the immigrant class or immigrant caste in our urban centers. What I wanted to talk a little bit about within the 8 or so minutes that I have left was what a visiting scholar at Harvard, Jones Correa, writes about in terms of the U.S. urban society going through very real structural changes, and I would argue structural changes that we see in California today, that we've seen in California since at least the 1980s, that'll be hallmarks of the kind of urban experiences our citizens and non-citizens have well into the 21st century. And these 4 changing urban dynamics or structures are that service and latter-day technological industries have supplanted manufacturing as a base, and we all know that. That a middle class has been exiting the central city for many, many years, but that kind of a new notion on that, or more recent phenomena, is seeing the African American middle class also depart central cities for the South, for the suburbs, for smaller urban centers, and so on and so forth. Third, that there continues to be a federal government urban scale back in terms of fund flows, public fund flows, that are increasingly not taking place and haven't been since the post-Nixon years, from Reagan on through the Clintonian Washington. And fourth, and the one I want to really concentrate on, is how immigration and immigrants have been transforming urban populations. And instead of going through all the numbers that I had here for a 25-minute presentation, I would be hung by you and them. I'll rather concentrate on a few anecdotes and a few stories and some things that you hear and or visit. For instance, when you go to South Central Los Angeles, or you get news on South Central Los Angeles if you don't visit that part of the vibrant community of Los Angeles very often. In 1980, the 1990 census tells us that in fact the population was basically 90% African American native born. The 1980 census, the 1990 census, scarcely 10 years later, gave indication that at least half of the population was Latino. Now, what is the 2000 census going to tell us? That a vast majority of the population in South Central Los Angeles is made up of Latinos of various stripes. What does that mean for shifting urban relations? Not only the demographic picture, but what does that mean politically? What does that mean socially? What does that mean culturally for inter-community relations? Well, there are some that put positive spins on that, and as Warren was suggesting, that LA, for better or for worse, is seeing that microcosm for California and perhaps much of the rest of the nation will be heading in terms of its urban centers over the next 20, 30 years. Well, on the one hand, you do have inter-community coalition building. But I got in trouble, I was telling Matt and some others just outside the doors before this particular panel opened, by serving Tim Hudson. About 3 or 4 years ago, I was chair of a panel that had Murd Dimely and some other people on the panel, and I was dealing with Intercommunity Coalition Building. I forget the exact title, and I thought it was a very dynamic panel. Liz Figueroa was part of that, and I thought we did a great job. But during the questions and answer period, and I had a lot of respect for Murd Dimely and for positions that he was taking. Especially early on as an assembly person before he was elected as his first statewide African American elected to office, because he was promoting what we call then black and brown unity in these seas of nationalism. He was one of the few voices back in the 60s that was trying to promote an intercommunity dialogue because he was aware of much of the dissonance that was taking place and increasing. And so as I opened that session, I thanked him for that. And he didn't know that he had made a great deal of sense to me, and that I found his writings as well as his speeches very helpful, and I noted them in my own scholarship. I'm a political scientist by training. But toward the end of the session, during the Q&A, and this is a beware for Matt here, in response to a question out there of why there's not more discussion taking place at grassroots level, where many of the solutions are taking place, but also where a vast majority of the problems are taking place in how communities are not connecting, and perhaps why sometimes. A kind of simplistic message rolled off of Diamelee's tongue, and that was, well, we simply have to build coalitions. Well, in the practical realism of LA that I had been part of, and I'd been studying for some time, I knew it wasn't that easy. And I said something to that effect, and in essence earned an enemy for life because he took it personally. But it is very, very difficult outside of a progressive core or cadre in urban centers to actually coalesce and remain coalesced for some time around common issues. It doesn't mean it's not happening, because it is happening. But in cases like South Central Los Angeles, and they might be the West San Gabriel Valley, where the mix is basically Latino, white, supplanted by Asian Pacifics, you get a very similar scenario. But the institutions, especially on the Latino side, are really not there in South Central. Who do you coalesce around? Who do you coalesce with? Who gives the call? What organizations are in the lead? And there have to be organizations that are in the lead on this. It's really a tough call, We're in the midst of a second great wave of immigration. I think we all realize that. Both is inspired by a lot of different things, including changes in the global technology. I think most all of us, when we're doing the charade thing, we think of immigration, somebody points that out. How would you characterize it? We think of low-wage labor coming across various borders. Well, coming across borders is true. But according to Madaris, an urban geographer at Cal State LA, he argues and he contends, looking at 1990 census data, that for the 1980s, leading up to 1990, a full 43% of the foreign-born population, or the newly arrived immigrants, I should say, in California, had high school education or higher degrees than that. In other words, it defies the common notion, and especially outside of the Silicon Valley, that in fact everybody coming across the border to work in the United States or to try to earn an economic livelihood is in fact going to be competing for the lowest wage, the lowest wage labor, and that in fact there's no education or skill background there. And it defies that. We're seeing a different kind of immigration. At the same time, we're seeing some of the old patterns revisited as well, but there is a new type that is there that'll continue into the new millennium. The impact on metropolitan America of this new wave, I think, has been substantial. But the very Jones Correa that I mentioned at the very beginning of this, 9.5 minutes ago, is that, also gives indication that those urban centers that have been most profoundly impacted in terms of numbers by immigration flows in the 1980s, four of the top 8 urban centers resulted or had urban implosions. We're looking for terms, I think Tim or Warren only, who also is the master of ceremonies of our annual dinner at the Pat Brown Institute, so we know each other well. He indicated that we're still confused about the terminology of what to call 1992 in Los Angeles, civil unrest, urban riots, insurrections. Well, I heard Angela you all know who Angela O is? Well, some of you do. There's about 3 heads nodding. The others are too tired. The blood sugars are still in competition, right? Belly and head. Well, she used the word implosions, urban implosions. So I've been using that. I kind of like the sound of it. But until I get criticized for using it, I'll say it's Angela's. Angela until very, very recently, was part of the 7-person President's Initiative on Race. And she was really the only person, outside of one other, but she was the only articulate voice for California having something to teach the rest of the nation in terms of race relations as the new millennium dawns. Warren only mentioned during his speech that he created a film, that was kind of an appendage of a montage of things that Angela took back not only to the Commission, but to the President and to Congress, saying that there are lessons that can be learned from California. There are lessons from the urban centers, and especially Los Angeles and the Bay Area. They can and should be learned. But she was running up against a stone wall of an old prism, of an old model that, you know, Fred, not so dissimilar from Fred was talking about, that looks at a society like it was 20 and 30 and 50 years ago. It hardly fits the new dynamic that California is becoming, its citizens are going to be facing and competing with and discussing for the next 20 or 30 years. Let me stop there.
Great. Thank you, Jaime. Let me say a couple of things, and then of course I want to open up, and I've been doing my best to rein in my colleagues so that we have plenty of time to have a conversation.
Hey, he even draws a happy face on the 1 minute.
Because I don't want to be too interventionist. This is sort of the slap and the shake at the same time. First, as far as the seating arrangements, we thought about where people should sit, and the only way possible so that no one would be sitting on the far right or the far left would be for everyone to sit in the middle, and I just don't want that many people on my lap right now. So let's move beyond that. Earlier today, in one panel, a panelist mentioned that attempting to wrap your hands around California is just impossible. 35 million people, huge geographic region, diversity, et cetera. All of these issues that we've been talking about for several days is such that we can't predict with any specificity what the nation is going to look like. She went as far as to suggest that anyone who tries would inevitably be embarrassed, and that therefore it was somewhat humorous or perhaps sad that bureaucrats sit around trying to do just that. What will the nation look like, excuse me, the state look like in 50 years, and how do we plan for that? And as I heard this, what I thought to myself was, well, what choice do we have? If Blade Runner is the metaphor of Los Angeles, and as Warren suggested, if Los Angeles is the metaphor of California, what choice do we have than to attempt with the greatest amount of data possible to, if not predict, at least sketch what the future of California will look like, and then plan accordingly. And I think what we've been trying to do, what certainly my colleagues have been trying to do over the summer, is to begin sketching that out. Not with the final specificity that we all hope for at some point, but to begin asking the questions. If this were a political science class, I'm also a political scientist, what I would do is the following. I would get up. First, I'd jump up and probably make you stand up so that your blood would get going again. We've been sitting for a long time. And I'd go to the chalkboard, and I would, along one column, identify the issues that have been brought up today. And there are many, but the ones that come to mind for me include, and again, this is not an exclusive list, diversity, specifically looking at emerging communities and emerging identities or identity politics, organizational capacity. Phil mentioned the increasing role of nonprofits of all sorts, like you might be talking about religiously affiliated nonprofits, filling the gap that governmental agencies are not able to do. Civic participation, this notion of democracy and so on and so forth. Technology, which of course is changing very quickly, whether it be cable, whether it be internet, or whether it be new technologies that are continuing to be created, as well as the traditional issues of immigration, which underlie all of these issues, as well as urban flight. We used to call it white flight, but of course what we're discovering is that as communities acquire the resources to get out of degraded urban areas, they choose to do so more and more, and this is perhaps a reasonable and rational response. Those would be the issues. Then I would say, okay, let's look at those issues according to 3 areas. What are the impacts on social, economic, and political spheres? And if we are successful, again, it's a political science class, we try and strive for some systematic analysis. If we are successful in applying an analysis that allows us to sketch what these impacts might be in these 3 areas, we begin to get a vision of California, which may not be the vision that we will actually arrive at, but at least a vision that is workable and that we could attempt to respond to. And ultimately, if I had to, as the moderator, pull these papers together, that's all I would say. And in a sense, that's all I will say. And what I want to do is then open it up for you, and I know that you may have some questions for these folks. Yes.
Yeah, I want to take off a little bit of what Nathan said about one small part, just offer some information. You asked about what is it that kids are learning in school about civic participation? And also, Fred's earlier thing about, now remember who the kids are. The kids are not Anglo kids. The kids are this very diverse population. And I've been working in that for about 30 years. My job is to train bilingual teachers. So I train teachers to teach social studies, okay? A quick answer is disastrous, because what kids are learning in social studies in California, by and large, is a curriculum that was seized in the mid-'80s by the right in the name of the California School Board. But the history social science curriculum is a curriculum adopted in the mid-'80s that reflects the 1950s. I mean, the civic education is 1950s civic education, and the kids in the school don't look like that at all. So yes, we're still presenting civic education, but what the kids know is somebody's presenting this stuff to me, and I know it's not true, you know, because they're presenting to me how a bill becomes a law. And I happen to know that if I live in McFarland, 90% of the power doesn't work that way anyway. Now, they're not PhDs in this stuff, but they know that the theory being taught doesn't match the street corner reality at all. And so my contribution is that I'm very, very concerned about what we're teaching young people about civic participation. And the disjuncture is that it's a chasm. It's an earthquake-sized chasm between what's being presented and the reality on the street and the reality of the students. And so I don't think we're teaching them anything except alienation from the political system.
Sometimes, though, I wouldn't focus exactly on the curriculum. I would ask, like, do they get to elect officers in class? Do they get to elect officers in their school? Do some of the kids run for these offices? You know, in most grammar schools, they still do this, I think. And so that's one of the ways in which you model democratic manners. And you know, some of the kids think it's stupid, and they don't participate in it, but some of them do, and they take it seriously. And I think that's how they sort of first learn about being small d Democrats, is by doing stuff like that. I know what you mean about the curriculum being out of date, and they don't relate to that. But hopefully they still get to run for office in their schools.
And in the most immediate, for example, here in Sacramento, in response to the state standards, and it's now proposed for Los Angeles, the same issue. In response to failing schools in Sacramento, what teachers are told is, don't teach social studies, teach reading and math. And I mean, this is a direct instruction from the superintendent. We don't have time for that social studies stuff. Teach reading and math. That's the proposal presently before the LA board, too. So another part of the mix is we're being told, stop teaching that stuff. First, it's not working, and second, stop teaching it anyway.
Well, that doesn't bode well.
Yeah. I'm sitting here wondering about several things, and I want to ask the panel if you'd like to address the question on a broader context. Simply, are there unresolvable issues? Or what are the unresolvable issues? When Amir started talking, I immediately thought of the fascinating book I'm reading called Fatherland by a journalist, Wall Street Journal journalist, this year, brand new book. His name is Frederick Kempe. And this is the issue, many of these issues, in Germany. And I was struck that in Germany today, there are 2.5 million Turks. And Kempe makes the kind of comparison that in some ways, for Germans that want to hate the Turks have become the Jews, and makes the very trenchant point. You can argue about the figures. When Hitler came to power, there were maybe 500,000 Jews in Germany. You got 5 times as many Turks. And many of these Turks don't want to be part of a Germany that doesn't want Turks. And as many of you know, there are structurally completely different problems there.